The Profumo affair. In the hot and steamy July of 1961, a hedonistic weekend at Lord Astor's Buckinghamshire estate, Clevedon, sent in motion a chain of events like no other. It is the subject of a new book by Vanessa Holburn. The book is called The Profumo Affair. Delighted to say that Vanessa joins us live on the line right now. Good morning to you, Vanessa.
Hi.
Good to have you with us. Isn't it amazing that here we are over 60 years later, but you just have to mention the word Profumo affair and everybody's internal monologue. Everybody gets this vision of you know, the as I say, the hot and steamy, illicit affairs, you know, high class ladies of negotiable virtue, a government brought down. It really is, it's an era defining event of the 60s, isn't it?
It certainly was, and I think it went on to have lots of implications. But what I think is really interesting is younger generations haven't heard of it. And I think that's probably worth talking about. And as well, it's still a modern story, the way that government ministers behave, the difference between age relationships between a teenager and a 40-year-old man, whether the police did their interviewing correctly. Things like that are still important to us.
Indeed. So for those who don't know, for those of the younger generation, not saying this is a throwback, but at the time, you know, the UK still has a minister for war, never mind a minister for defence. Yeah.
I mean, you know, again, a lot of people, you know, the war finished in the 40s, but those things were still spilling over. We still had, you know, in the 60s, we were still dealing with the threat of communism. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was very integral to how we were behaving. One of the main players in the situation, if you like, was a Russian diplomat. Officially, he was a naval attaché, but he was, you know, a known Russian spy, which all Russian diplomats in our country at the time would have been. You know, the governments were still very cagey around each other. And that's, you know, what was important, really. You know, when you're mixing with certain people, if they've got other ulterior motives, that's what you need to be aware of.
So let's go through the key players then, especially let's start with Profumo first of all, because it's named after Profumo himself.
Yeah, interestingly, it's named after him. He was a government minister. He was in his 40s at the time. He was married. He was also part of the aristocracy. His family owned the Prudential company. So very well off, married to an actress, you know, a charmed life, if you like, had always been earmarked, I think, for a political career in the Conservative Party.
And this is Macmillan's government, isn't it, that we're talking about at this point, are we?
Yes, yeah, Harold Macmillan. So then he was very taken with a young girl, Christine Keeler, who probably we most associate with the Profumo affair.
Yeah.
She was just 19 when they dated.
And here's the thing, how do they first meet? Because you'd think a 40-something-year-old government minister, high-ranking government cabinet minister, and a 19-year-old, and it refers to her in the things as a showgirl, shall we say, and model. Yeah. How do they meet?
At a party held by Bill Astor in the Clevedon estate in Buckinghamshire, partly due to the fact that Christine Keeler was friends with an osteopath, a society osteopath and portrait painter, Stephen Ward. So they headed up to this party and, that's where they met, in the swimming pool there.
And Profumo is... And it's interesting to see this through the lens of, when you put modern lenses on, isn't it? Because at the time, they say, you know, Profumo is smitten with the girl and the teenager and falls in love with, or, you know, decides that he must start a relationship with her. If we look at this now, I mean, we think, well, that's A, it's age inappropriate, and B, it's practically grooming.
Yes, definitely. And again, she was, you know, a girl from a very impoverished background in Wraysbury in Berkshire. She lived she grew up in railway carriages that had been converted into houses with, without running water and electricity when she was younger. She had very little education, minimal background and support. And here was a man who was very well educated. He went to Oxford, as his father had. Lots of money, lots of education. a big network to support him. So we're not looking at, a love-struck individual. We're looking at perhaps a man who saw a beautiful young girl as she was as an object, something he wanted to possess, and perhaps didn't really think any further than that.
And it's that heady mess, isn't it, of sex and seediness and what will become a scandal. But also what I find interesting is the way that despite this whole very conservative, you never had it so good establishment, and we'll see this later with Boothby and the Craze, for example, and the way that politics and criminality and showbiz kind of mix, because Ward and Keeler are also sort of hanging out in the underwood. I'm not saying they're panning up to sort of serious London gangsters, but they're definitely heading out in perhaps more bohemian quarters of London at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think politicians weren't either. It was a very crisscross society. London was much smaller then. I think we might think now that how on earth would a politician end up in a club? Christine Keeler was a showgirl at a club, which is sort of a mixture of being a hostess, I suppose, and a dancer. Although if you were naked, you weren't allowed to dance, you had to stand still. And that was acceptable for grown men who were married to go to those clubs. So that there was a crisscross of society, if you like, and Christine and Stephen Ward definitely did go to clubs that, as you say, we might consider bohemian. It's a social life in London. It's mixed, it's multicultural. And
of course, then we have the added thing of Evgeny Ivanov, of course, who was ostensibly a Russian diplomat. He's a Russian spy, Soviet spy, and he's also in a relationship with Keeler.
Yeah, so he was friends with Stephen Ward. Stephen Ward, was portrayed as, it might be too strong a word, a communist sympathiser. But I think we're looking again at a time when politics, we'd just seen a massive rise in fascism across Europe, and we wanted a solution to that. We didn't want fascism to take hold. We're still dealing now with the fallout of the war in a way, and the things that were left behind, the powers that came to the fore in the post-war period. I would say, if anything, Stephen Ward was perhaps open to many political viewpoints, whereas perhaps people who'd grown up in the English establishment saw only one way ahead politically. And of course,
added to that, of course, is Stephen's sexuality, because he is a gay man at a time when homosexuality is illegal in the UK.
I mean, I don't know that if they ever confirmed that, but certainly he didn't have... he had more of in some ways, a modern, fluid approach to his sexuality. He certainly had sex with Mandy Rice Davis at some point and things like that. So he wasn't just strictly homosexual.
Okay.
He might have been bisexual.
Right. Mandy, yes, you just mentioned another name who became a darling of the tabloids, to put it mildly, and that's Mandy Rice Davis. Tell us a little bit about her.
So she was a friend of Christine. She was just a couple of years younger, headed up to London like Christine did, really, to find the fortune. Things were very limited if you were an uneducated woman in the 60s. It's not as if you could stride into any job. I mean, there's still obviously sexism and gender pay gap in the workplace today, but it was even worse in those days. So she was interested in being a model. She'd had some success. She did have a lovely family, and she did have some education. So, yeah, they were friends. They hung out, and like any teenagers, really, they were hoping to have a good time and some partying.
So is there a grand revelation, or do obviously people in the corridors of power know what's going on, and is nobody sort of pulling Profumo to one side and saying, listen here, old boy, I think, we all appreciate it's a pretty young thing, but I think you would have a serious look at yourself?
Yeah, definitely. There were whispers around Westminster. And I suspect that there was quite an open culture, if you like, of not quite an old boys club, but the idea that men did have affairs. And I don't think, he was chastised for that, really. The problem really was that he was in a situation where he lied to Parliament.
When you say, explain how he lies to Parliament. Are there questions in the House, or what's the situation?
That's exactly it. Some of the Labour MPs, obviously, looking as they do today for anything to bring up as the opposition party. They had heard these rumours and they asked questions in the House using parliamentary privilege to mention Christine Keeler by name, and he denied it.
So when's the revelation then? When does this thing break and break it does in a huge way?
Yeah, 1963, we're looking at, a lot of press activity. Those were the days of what they now call checkbook journalism. So people could sell stories, and, there was a bit of to and fro between all the different newspapers, the tabloids, Christine Keeler's story, Stephen Ward's story, things like that. There were lots of negotiations, and eventually it became quite obvious that Profumo had lied, and so he did have to resign.
And what are the shockwaves that this? Because it's 1963 now, and I hate to drop the B word in, but Beatlemania it is the beginning. People say the 63 is the beginning of the 60s, really, and so this is the new. Nothing sort of personifies the establishment or the change that's coming across Britain than this affair, and of course David Bailey's iconic, and I use that word advisedly, photograph of Keeler as well.
Yeah. There weren't David Bailey pics, but I know that when she's on.
Oh, sorry, isn't it Bailey? I thought it was a Bailey pic. Sorry.
No, I think it's.
Anyway, that photograph.
Yeah, that very infamous photograph where was she naked, wasn't she? Yeah, I think looking back, we have this idea that the 60s was a period of change, but actually at the time there was still very much an establishment feeling. It was Christine Keeler when she attended the Old Bailey for Stephen Ward's case. It was her that people screamed at and threw tomatoes at. It was her that was sort of hounded, if you like, as a woman of low virtue. No one sort of pointed the finger really at John Profumo, and he did go on to get an OBE for charitable work that he did later in his life.
It's interesting because they make this the story of redemption. In his obituaries, they say, well, he very nobly then went off and didn't hold the limelight, didn't sell his memoirs. He then dedicated his life to charity in the community. And that's all that well and good, but only because he got caught out, you could argue.
Yeah, and I think only because he had the opportunity to do that, because he didn't have to earn a living, because he had family wealth to fall back on. And I've no doubt that he was great in his job, because he sort of moved into a fundraising role. What's better than a charming man who's well connected to people with a lot of money to do your fundraising for you? That's great, and you can't take away that he did some good. But I don't think he was hounded in the same way that Christine Keeler was at all. And I think that's very unfair, given that he was a married man in his 40s and she was an unmarried teenager.
You talked about Ward's trial. What was Ward's trial then, for those who don't know?
So he was on trial for being a pimp, basically. And he actually committed suicide while the trial was coming to its conclusion. He was found guilty, and he died in hospital a few days after his suicide attempt. That was it. Many people feel that he was unfairly tried, because how much money could he had his own money. He had his own source of income from two businesses, painting portraits of the rich and famous and being an osteopath. Does he really need 20 quid here or there? That may have been given as a gift to Christine Keeler when she had a date with someone who, had a lot of money, and maybe they gave her a gift, maybe they gave her 20 quid. Yeah, so that was a very weak case, if you like.
So what inspired you or interested you to write about the Profumo case? Is it to give a new look then at?
I think so. I mean, I live relatively close to Cliveden, and because I was a teenager myself in the 80s when they had the big, the film Scandal, which was very popular. Very beautiful, popular actress played it, Joanna Wally Kilmer. And I think, I had this sanitized view of it, if you like, that it was quite glamorous, that she had a glamorous life in the 60s. And then the more I found out about it, my viewpoint's quite different now, I think, from when I started. The work that Christine's son, Seymour Platt, has done, looking for a pardon for her because she actually went to Holloway Prison for perjury, which was connected to, some might say boyfriend, other people might say stalker, that she just didn't know how to deal with and had no help dealing with. So her life was not as easy, perhaps, as we might think it was.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. This is a story, if you like, with no winners, are there? Nobody comes out of this. There is no redemption per se.
No. And I think another aspect of it is it's very hard to know exactly what happened because the files, the archives, all the evidence has been sealed far longer than any other archival material has, and it won't even be open now until 2048.
Wow.
And so that was quite a long period of time for the government to decide we don't need to look at paperwork.
So what do you hope that people will learn from this? Is it because, again, like yourself, my memory of the Profumo scandal, apart from some ancient history, is basically the film and Ian McKellen's haircut in it. So therefore, and John Hurt's brilliant portrayal of Ward. I mean, as you said, that's a sanitized version. So you're hoping that people will learn a bit more about this and see it for not as the glitzy sort of, high people in high places doing steamy things, but actually, the fact that it was grubby.
Yeah, I think it's great now that we've got a language for things like coercive relationships, stalking, harassment, gaslighting. It throws a new light on misogyny and racism within the police force at that time. These are issues we're still facing, questions we're still asking, and I think it's great to. Yeah, just to take modern eyes on something. When
you say racism, because of the West Indian background of some of the associates,
so
or what was that?
Christine Keeler, the perjury case is connected to the conviction of a man. As I mentioned, some people described him as her boyfriend, but he was actually a violent criminal. He had already been convicted of violent crime towards women, and after he was released from prison, he went on again to reoffend in a violent manner. He was obsessed with Christine Keeler also, determined that she would be his girlfriend, and he was arrested for assault. Some of the evidence that Christine Keeler gave to the police were missing the fact that there were two guys in her flat at the time that could have acted as witnesses. So effectively, she lied under oath. And she was put inside Holloway for perjury.
The book is called The Profumo Affair. It is by Vanessa Holburn, who we're speaking to today. Vanessa, if people want to find out more information about you or about the book, is there social media? Do you have a website? Where can people find you?
Easiest place is probably Instagram at Vanessa Holburn Writer, because I'm also a journalist. So, yeah, I've got a lot of writing going on backwards and forwards. You should be able to Google me too, and that will come up.
Brilliant. The book is called The Profumo Affair. It's by Vanessa Holburn, who is speaking to today. Vanessa, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.